There are now 3 promising COVID-19 vaccines that tout a 90% plus efficacy. Some warming numbers when you consider the chill of the pandemic continues to hit Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and now the Atlantic bubble is on hiatus. This has been a global effort to find a vaccine for COVID. Labs around the world have been keeping the lights on at night to bring us one step closer to the end. Canada has inked deals with 7 different manufacturers for a total of 414 million doses, enough to vaccinate the whole country 5 times over. Now, when we did the podcast, only the Pfizer vaccine was known, but with the other 2, the UnpublishedTV question can refer to the others. If a vaccine is safe and effective, according to Health Canada, how soon do you feel it will be available to the public? And after 3 months, 15.1%, 6 months, and overwhelmingly 37.7%, 12 months, just 1.9%, longer than 12 months, I found surprising, 34%, and undecided, 11.3%. Now, however you're watching and listening to our show, whether through our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, or our podcast channels, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and more, I'd like to remind you can still cast your vote on this topic at unpublished.vote and email your MP to tell them why. Now, when it comes to a safe and effective COVID vaccine, the discovery, testing, and approval are needed. But what are the distribution challenges of getting it to 38 million people? Manufacturing. Is there enough capacity to produce? And an interesting angle from a new Duke University report which finds first world countries are hedging their bets on acquiring it. Now, joining us to discuss all this, I am pleased to be joined by Ian Colbert. He's Executive Director of the Canadian Public Health Agency. Elise Legault is the Policy and Advocacy Manager with One. And Dr. Jason Nickerson is the Humanitarian Affairs Advisor with Doctors Without Borders. And I want to thank all 3 of you for joining us this evening. And let's talk about distribution first. And Ian, this will be the largest public health effort. Is Canada ready for this?
No, it's quite simply we're not.
No.
Depending on which vaccine we're talking about, the Pfizer and Moderna products both have to be stored at minus 70 degrees Celsius, and we do not have a supply chain that will support that. The AstraZeneca product is something that's more in line with the seasonal influenza vaccine. It can be stored at from 2 to 8 degrees Celsius, so your traditional refrigerators will take care of that. But as far as the size and scope of manufacturing and distribution to actually inoculation sites of how many vaccinations locations we're going to have, it is unparalleled in Canadian history. So we have a lot of work to do in the coming months.
And Elise, I imagine one challenge for Canada in getting this distributed across the country is obviously geography is a challenge considering the size of the country, coast to coast, and then of course up to the coast towards the Arctic. What kind of a challenge will this be for Canada's Indigenous people?
Sorry. That's I'm sure it's going to be a huge challenge. I must say I'm not an expert in distribution of vaccine necessarily in Canada, but what's going to be important is also for the government to decide who's going to get the vaccine first as a priority. And there has been some guidelines that have been interim guidelines that have been published recently in terms of who's going to get it first, and there's going to be question about whether Indigenous communities should be quite on top of the list of getting it first, along with healthcare workers and the most at risk, the elderly, people with pre-existing conditions. So I don't think we know exactly who's going to get it in what order as well. We have some rough idea.
And what do you think, Jason?
In terms of distribution in Canada?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can certainly speak from the perspective of Doctors Without Borders, MSF. I mean, we're a medical humanitarian organization that works in more than 70 different countries under really quite difficult field circumstances, and we're a major provider of vaccinations, both preventatively and in response to disease outbreaks. And certainly, I can say that for us. Vaccinating tens or hundreds of thousands of people, this is a massive undertaking. You're talking about major supply chain requirements. You're talking about significant cold chain requirements. And that's for a normal set of vaccinations. So if we're talking about something like the Pfizer or the Moderna product, that, as Ian mentioned, has really significant cold chain requirements down to -70. This is a significant challenge for any health system anywhere in the world. And to be honest, we have actually very limited experience as a global public health community in trying to do this with vaccines that require cold chain storage down that cold. The sort of immediate example that I can point to is the Ebola vaccine, which is actually a Canadian development and discovery, the RVSV ZBOV vaccine. That has cold chain requirements of somewhere around -80 degrees Celsius. And that's been deployed in clinical trials in West Africa. And then more recently in the last two Ebola outbreaks in Democratic Republic of Congo. So I worked during one of those outbreaks last year in North Kivu. And I can tell you, this is a significant undertaking to actually set up the infrastructure that's required to maintain that level of cold storage. Because it's not just about, one freezer or one sort of set of cold chain. You're actually talking about how do you get the vaccine from the manufacturing site onto a plane, distributed to, distribution centers that are kind of central, and then out to additional levels of additional storage, and then ultimately out to the field and out to the vaccination sites that Ian was talking about. So it's not just kind of like one freezer that you need to have in place. You're actually talking about a lot of different kinds of cold chain technologies that all need to work really in sync. So whether we're talking about a country like Canada or any other country, this is a really massive undertaking, and it's going to require a lot of planning. And as Ian said, infrastructure that currently doesn't exist because it hasn't had to exist.
Now, Ian, we talked about the supply chains. There's a public supply chain and a private supply chain. What's the difference for the viewers?
Well, certainly the private chain I would be from the manufacturer to whatever government is purchasing it from. Then the public supply chain kicks in. So you're right. There's two different systems in play here, and they have to be really closely synchronized so that you don't have any gaps in the supply chain at all. It's certainly one of the reasons that the challenges posed by the cold chain requirement of -70 degrees is one of the reasons why we're glad to see that there are so many vaccine candidates in the running, because hopefully there's going to be a multitude of vaccines that get approved for COVID-19, which will have different profiles, which will be more appropriate for different target populations. And we won't necessarily have to have these probably incredibly expensive cold chain systems set up all around the world, because quite honestly, it's just not feasible.
Oh, definitely not. And Elise, I imagine there's quite a few nations around the world that would have a lot of difficulty in adapting or getting the infrastructure to hold a vaccine at -70.
For sure, that's a problem. Although, as Jason pointed out, it is interesting that the Ebola vaccine did require a quite cold chain system as well, and they did manage to deliver it everywhere. So it could be surprising that sometimes these experience could be it could be that in some developing countries there is more experience in these types of vaccines than there could be in Canada. That being said, it is possible. It does happen. But it will be a huge challenge. So there are definitely people that think that maybe other of the candidates like AstraZeneca that we got fairly good news from today could be better suited in developing countries. And another aspect of it, of course, is the price as well. Both Moderna, I think, is the most expensive of the lot. I don't know the price by heart, but I think it's maybe between $35 and $50 a dose or something. Jason, you would know that, but AstraZeneca at least is as promised to sell it around $3 a dose, at least in developing countries. They're selling it at cost, so that makes a huge difference in which vaccine is most appropriate in different circumstances as well.
So $3 is the cost, but in third world, that's what they get. But and I think, Jason, that's where we're talking about here is, you're going to charge a first world country $35 or $50 for a shot when you're charging third world country. to me, I don't see. Is there not a lot of government investment in here to start these research and development to get there? And why would those who are doing that getting hammered just as bad?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of public funding that's gone into the development of COVID vaccines, as well as COVID therapeutics, diagnostic tests, even new models of ventilators that have been scaled up relatively quickly. I mean, I think that this is, in many ways, an unprecedented public investment of funding in a very small amount of time towards one very particular disease, and I would say, wholly appropriate as well. I mean, this is one of the roles that government should be playing in responding to infectious diseases and health concerns in general. I think we need, in fact, more of this investment earlier on, so that we're investing in this capacity and investing in the kinds of vaccines and other health technologies that we need to be able to prepare so that we can scale up for future pandemics, because there will be more. So the argument that I think that you're alluding to is the fact that the public is paying, but what strings are attached to that funding, and sort of what access and affordability rights are guaranteed or required as a condition of receiving that funding? And the answer is none. Really, as a rule, most governments provide this kind of funding with no strings attached, and that's true of the Canadian government as well. And that's a model that perhaps in earlier days, maybe it made sense. It was sort of stimulating investment and needed research and development, and this is the vehicle for getting there. The reality is, we live in a world where medicines cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient per year now, and many of those originate with public funding. And I think it's quite unfair for us to simply have that money go out the door without these kinds of conditions being attached. And we have faced many challenges over many decades now in being able to access medicines that our patients need, simply because they're unaffordable. And today, in COVID times, where governments are opening up tremendous amounts of funding to develop the technologies that we need, it really doesn't make any sense for that funding to go out and to potentially fund significant portions of this development or the manufacturing scale up without some sort of expectation of fair pricing, or that these technologies would be made accessible for people in lower income countries to be able to access. I think that this is fundamentally a conversation that we, as a country, need to be having. Is what is the sort of public return on public investment for these kinds of technologies?
Ian, I'm wondering, in terms of manufacturing a vaccine, could Canada actually, like, depending on which one it is, could Canada actually manufacture it, or do we have the capacity? Do we have the capacity?
No, we do not have the capacity today. Certainly, there are facilities being built to support the vaccine candidate being developed by Medicago, which is a plant-based vaccine, which holds a great deal of promise, and that's a Canadian company. And that company wouldn't exist without the investments that we've talked about. I think that it's the challenge of living in a free enterprise capitalistic society is that pharmaceutical companies, vaccine manufacturers, all have stakeholders, and their primary accountability is back to those stakeholders, not to the public that they serve. They serve stakeholders. So it is going to be an ongoing challenge to find that happy medium. We've done it in areas perhaps not as well as we could have, such as HIV medications, and making them more accessible in low and middle income countries. I think it is part of a kind of a equalization strategy where northern high income countries are paying a higher price, and so that low and middle income countries can afford to access vaccines and other drugs that should be covered in a similar manner.
At least when you hear the government invests in obviously the research and the R&D for the vaccine, but then again, there's no strings attached. Do you think there's too much support for big pharma by governments whether it be Canada or governments around the world?
I mean, governments are placed in a difficult situation. Obviously, we need the pharmaceutical companies to develop these vaccines, and I think that when we're in the middle of a crisis, the pharmaceutical companies have a lot of sway in the negotiations. They have a lot of power because they hold the key to getting us outside of this pandemic. So I think what has happened is that, unfortunately, for example, in terms of the vaccines, governments have been competing against each other, negotiating with the companies entirely in secret. Of course, we don't know. We know very little about the deals that, for example, Canada has made. We don't know exactly when we're going to get the doses. We know the total amount of doses. We don't know how much we're paying. All of these things are secret, and the pharmaceutical companies are sort of playing the governments a little bit against each other, and that's unfortunate because we shouldn't be competing against each other. We're competing against the virus. So a much more a concerted, coordinated effort would be suitable. And what's good this time around, there is an initiative called COVAX, which is where countries got together with like major global health organizations that sort of said, let's do this together, let's negotiate as a bloc, and let's support a vast portfolio of candidates, and then distribute them equitably and in the most effective way to end the pandemic. But so that's positive. This has happened. It's supported by more than 180 countries, including Canada. But unfortunately, at the same time, in parallel to this, countries have also struck their bilateral deals, and they also entered into that race to who's going to get the most deals. And quite surprisingly, I would say Canada did quite well. We have a lot of vaccine options. We have the most per capita in the world, as you were saying, 10 potential doses per person. Of course, they're not all necessarily going to work out. But it's unfortunate that it's a competition like that. And I do think that it gives more power to pharmaceutical companies, that if government just got together and said, hey, you're negotiating with all of us, rather than playing each other off.
What do you think about that, Jason?
Well, there's a lot to say. Maybe just to try and bring a few of these threads together. Coming back to one of the things that Ian said earlier, which is that there's a number of different vaccine candidates that are being developed right now. Right, we're talking about the three that have reported results via press release. We haven't actually seen the final studies and the data, but if we take the press releases at their word, then it certainly sounds like we've got three highly effective, quite promising vaccines. But as we're talking about some of these considerations of cold chain requirements and dosing regimens and that sort of thing, I think that this really gets at the heart for us of why it's so important that we have this kind of large-scale investment from governments, but also the private sector, because clearly they've invested as well in these kinds of technologies, because not all vaccines are going to be the right vaccine for all age demographics, or for adapted for use in all different contexts and so on. There's many things that I think we're going to learn about how these vaccines work, what they actually do, what kinds of illnesses they prevent. Does that stop someone from getting infected and then transmitting the virus onto somebody else, or does it, or does it reduce the severity of the illness? There's a lot of things that we still don't know yet. We're very early on into this, but certainly, one of the reasons that we need this kind of investment is so that we have a lot of tools that are in the toolbox. And for an organization like ours that vaccinates populations in very difficult field circumstances, having a vaccine that's heat stable and thermostable is incredibly important, because we often need to transport things a long distance to reach the populations that we work with and the communities that we work with. So, I don't think that we can take our foot off the gas pedal yet. I think it's incredibly important that we don't, because we actually need a plurality of options, because they're all going to do slightly different things, and that's going to be really important. So, coming back to the vaccine options that Canada has secured for itself, as we've said a few times now, we're talking about somewhere north of 400 million doses for a population of 38 million people. Probably some of those vaccines are not going to work as well as we hope that they're going to. But even with the 3 that are so far presenting results, Canada may very well find itself with a surplus of vaccines. And so then the question becomes simply one of basic math of, if we have more than enough doses to vaccinate 38 million people, what's going to happen to those doses? There's really only, I would say, one correct answer to that question, which is that they should be given to countries that do not have enough doses. I think that this is, surely nobody can disagree with the idea that we shouldn't be hoarding doses of a vaccine that are in high demand and short supply around the world. And so I think that this is a conversation that we need to be having in Canada right now is, if we end up with a surplus, which it looks like, potentially we might, or very well will, what's going to happen to those doses? We shouldn't sit on them.
No, that's for sure.
Just to add to that as well, the real problem is that there's not going to be enough supply for a while, for maybe a year or 2 years. There's not going to be 14 billion doses if it's a 2-dose regimen. So yes, those that are hoarded or kept somewhere in Canada are not saving a life, or not ending the pandemic sooner. So I completely agree with Jason that it's an important question. And I would say, if the government thinks about that, maybe donating or transferring, I hope this conversation or this thinking doesn't happen in 6 months or a year. Like, we shouldn't be sitting on these things while healthcare workers, people at risk in developing countries will not be vaccinated. There needs to be a conversation about this very soon.
Just to clarify, if I may, Canada has options to purchase. They haven't actually purchased a single dose yet. So my guess is that as vaccine candidates are approved, they will purchase the amount that they need and then release those other options so that they are available to the worldwide market. It's not like we're going to buy all 400 million doses and sit on them.
Yeah, and I've heard this comment a number of times, and I think that what we need is to just say that, right? Like, if this is what the Canadian government is presenting us with, then let's just say that, right? Like, let's be clear. We've had a number of analyses showing, okay, Canada's got options to be able to purchase enough vaccine doses to vaccinate the Canadian population 5 times. Then I think let's just be clear about what these agreements are and what they aren't. And if they are options to purchase and Canada's intention is to not over-purchase and over-consume, then great, let's just say that and let's move on, because we in the global health community are quite worried about what access is going to look like. We know that manufacturing capacity is insufficient to be able to produce, as Elise said, enough doses to vaccinate 7 billion people at the drop of the hat. So let's have just a little bit more transparency and clarity into what doses are actually going to be tied up, which ones aren't, and move the conversation forward, because we just need to be finding realistic and pragmatic solutions here.
Ian, is it not prudent planning on behalf of a government to secure as many as they need?
I was just going to add that at this point, we don't know which of the vaccines on which we have options are actually going to get through phase 3 trials and be approved. So yeah, the government Canada is hedging its bets. And yeah, it is going to have to be much more transparent and clear once we know which vaccine candidates are approved for use in Canada.
Now, when we talked about hoarding, I was talking to Elise about that, and you say it's self-defeating, these countries that are stocking up on that. Why is that, or how is that?
Well, because in fact, many experts have been saying the most effective way to end the pandemic would be to start by vaccinating the most at-risk people, the elderly, healthcare workers everywhere, rather than going one country by one country, vaccinating every single person in the richest countries and then go backward. If our goal is to end the pandemic sooner, and if our goal is to save as many lives as possible, there was some modeling done by Northeastern University recently that showed that fairly distributing the first 2 or 3 billion doses across the world would save twice as many lives than if the vaccine is only available in rich countries at first. It also has enormous economic costs, because as long as the pandemic rages on in the world, it's going to affect the world economy and therefore the Canadian economy as well. So to kind of lower the transmission, save as many lives as possible, it would be better to start gradually everywhere. But that's probably not what's going to happen now that rich countries, including Canada, have hedged their bets and got a lot of contracts. And of course, it's a delicate position that the government is in. Let's not be naive about it. Like, of course, the Canadian government wants to vaccinate all Canadians as quick as possible. Like, that's completely understandable. That's their first goal. But what we're trying to say is, let's not forget the rest of the world, and let's make sure that the most at risk can start getting vaccinated like in a few months, not 2 years from now, everywhere in the world. I think ultimately everyone will benefit. So a lot more investments are needed as well. Canada has invested in the COVAX facility for lower income countries, but much more money will be needed. So we're going to need more investments soon, and we're going to benefit from it ultimately.
And Jason, regarding COVAX, we've got a number of notables that are absent from the table there, the U.S., Russia, and China. What kind of concern does that have for you?
Well, I mean, look, this is a number of people have used different analogies, but we're effectively building the airplane as it's flying. So, yeah, I mean, absolutely, these are notable countries to have absent, but there's also a large number of countries who are participating, and so there's a number of concerns, I would say, about COVAX, and maybe concerns isn't the right word, but certainly the devil is in the details with these kinds of major global health initiatives. But I don't think that we should lose sight of the fact that this is a really phenomenal undertaking. I mean, we're fundamentally talking about probably the largest global health procurement initiative for a single medical product that's ever been attempted, and to do that in a way that's guided by an equitable access framework, and to put equitable and access and affordability at the center of this initiative that's only a few months old. I mean, this is a really tremendous undertaking, to be honest. And so, I think that it's important that we're vigilant, and it's important that we ask difficult questions about how COVAX is going to be designed and how it's going to roll things out, because we have seen with previous what are called advanced market commitments, there's only been one. It was for a pneumococcal conjugate vaccine about a decade ago. We saw that there were some important oversights in that mechanism. So, for example, there was no humanitarian access mechanism, meaning that when MSF and other humanitarian organizations were needed to purchase pneumonia vaccines directly from the manufacturers, we weren't able to get the lowest global price, which now is about $3.10. And in fact, we're charged over $60 per dose, which was sort of the going market rate price. And that's just it's something that wasn't really thought of as being essential in the design of this thing in the early phases, was some sort of humanitarian access mechanism. But we vaccinate people who can't access health systems, either because they're systematically excluded from accessing health services, or they're in a refugee camp, or many other reasons. And so these are the kinds of things that we and others in the global health community are learning from, and are questioning, and are making sure are gaps that are going to be addressed and that are closed. So, I think that there's a lot of really important initiatives and a lot of important things that we have learned about global health and fair access to medicines and vaccines over many decades. And we're pushing for things like transparency into pricing, and pushing to make sure that COVAX is negotiating firmly to have the lowest global price that's possible for these vaccines, because a fair price is going to increase access. That's just the bottom line.
Yeah. Ian, what lessons did we learn from SARS that might be applied here?
Quite honestly, less from SARS, more from H1N1.
Okay.
There was never a vaccine for SARS, and it really became an institution-based virus that had a short shelf life, thankfully. H1N1 is more along the same lines. Only 40% of Canadians ended up being vaccinated, and it was still a Herculean effort to have that done. So I would say a year from now, when I believe that the real mass vaccination programs are going to be rolling out for the first dose for Canadians, it's going to take a lot of effort. And a lot of people who aren't at the front of the line are going to have to be patient and be good neighbors and let the right people go to the front of the line.
Good words to finish with. Thank you very much. I want to thank our guest this evening, Ian Culbert, Executive Director of the Canadian Public Health Agency. Elise Legault is the Policy and Advocacy Manager with ONE, and Dr. Jason Nickerson is the Humanitarian Affairs Advisor with Doctors Without Borders. Coming up on the next Unpublished TV, are the kids all right? The pandemic has had an impact on them and opened up their eyes to more. Thanks for watching Unpublished TV. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.